So have you ever wondered why your local mayor and your national leader always seem to be locked in an argument over who actually gets to make the rules? Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to break down exactly how vast, incredibly diverse nations manage to share power without, completely falling apart. We are looking at the literal architecture of how countries are run, and we'll be using India as our prime case study today. It's a genuinely fascinating look at the ultimate balancing act of political power. To keep things moving, we've broken this down into 5 quick chapters. What is federalism? The 2 routes to federation, the Indian federal system, federalism in practice, and finally, the 3rd tier.
Let's jump straight into Section 1. What is federalism?
Honestly, it is incredibly easy to look at a globe or just watch the evening news and feel totally confused about who is really in charge. You constantly hear terms thrown around like union government, central government, federal government, or state government. If that makes you scratch your head, you are definitely not alone. It can feel like this massive, tangled web of politicians who are all claiming authority over the exact same space. But here is the core definition that clears it all up. Federalism is basically just a power-sharing arrangement. Power is explicitly divided between a central authority and the country's various constituent units, like states or provinces. This means you have at least 2 tiers of government. And here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. Both of these levels answer separately and directly to you, the voter. The central government can't just dictate orders to the state governments on a whim.
To really get this, look at this stark contrast between a unitary system and a federal system. In a unitary system, like in Sri Lanka, the national government holds all the practical power. Any subunits are entirely subordinate to them. Contrast that with Belgium. Back in 1993, Belgium actually shifted from a unitary to a federal system for one specific reason: to guarantee its regional governments independent constitutional power that the central government literally could no longer just take away. Now, globally, out of 193 countries, only 25 have a federal political system. Sounds like a tiny club, right? But do not let that small number fool you. Because federations are typically adopted by massive countries, those 25 nations actually hold a staggering 40% of the world's entire population. We're talking about places like Canada, the US, Brazil, Australia, and of course, India. So, how do these massive systems form in the first place? That brings us to Section 2, 2 routes to federation. History shows us that countries face a huge choice when structuring their survival, and it leads to 2 very different routes. The first is what we call the coming together route. Imagine completely independent states willingly pooling their sovereignty to form a bigger, stronger unit solely to increase their mutual security. Think of the USA or Australia. In these systems, all constituent states usually have equal power. The second route is holding together. This is much more reactive. It happens when an already massive, incredibly diverse country decides it simply has to divide its power between the national government and the states just to prevent the nation from fracturing apart. India, Spain, and Belgium followed this path to accommodate regional diversity. And typically, in this setup, the central government remains quite powerful. Which brings us right into Section 3, the Indian federal system. The Indian Constitution elegantly organizes this whole holding together power struggle by dividing things into 3 distinct lists. First, the Union list. This covers massive national issues where you absolutely need a uniform policy across the board, things like defense, banking, and currency. Only the central government makes laws here. Then you have the state list for day-to-day administration. Police, trade, agriculture, that's handled exclusively by state governments. Finally, there's the concurrent list. This includes shared interests, like education and forests. Both tiers can make laws here, but, and this is a big but, if there's a conflict between the 2, the union law prevails.
But keep in mind, in a holding together federation, the power is not perfectly equal across the board. It's not a one-size-fits-all. For instance, under Article 371, states like Assam, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, and Mizoram have special powers designed specifically to protect indigenous land rights and unique cultures. On the complete flip side, you have areas that are too small to be independent states, places like Chandigarh, Lakshadweep, and the capital city of Delhi. These are classified as union territories, and they're run directly by the central government, holding very little autonomous power compared to a full state.
All right, move into Section 4, Federalism in Practice, because theory is great on paper, but reality is a whole different beast. To survive, the Indian federal system had to successfully navigate 3 highly volatile stress tests over the decades.
First, starting around 1947, the country took the enormous risk of completely redrawing its internal boundaries to create new states based on the languages people spoke. It was a huge gamble that ultimately united the country further. Then came the language policy crisis of 1965. And finally, a massive shift in the national political landscape around 1990 that changed just about everything. Let's zoom in on that language test for a second. Looking at objective demographic data from the census shows exactly why the government needed a very, very cautious language policy. The Constitution didn't actually declare a single national language. While Hindi is the official language and the largest language group, it's the mother tongue of only about 44% of the population. That means way more than half the country speaks something else entirely. So, when non-Hindi speaking states pushed back aggressively against stopping the use of English for official work back in 1965, the central government wisely compromised. They allowed English to continue, which basically avoided a major national conflict. And that brings us to the 1990 shift, an era that fundamentally cemented federalism in everyday practice. See, for decades, the same political party ruled at the center and in most states. And sometimes that led to the central government simply dismissing state governments they didn't happen to agree with. But after 1990, the era of coalition governments kicked into high gear. National parties couldn't secure a clear majority alone anymore, so they were forced to form alliances with regional state parties. This interreliance severely limited the center's ability to arbitrarily dismiss state governments, massively strengthening regional autonomy in the process. Which perfectly sets up our final chapter, Section 5, the third tier or decentralization. Our source material features this brilliant little analogy from a cartoon character discussing this exact system, and it hits the nail right on the head. They remark, "So, we are like a 3-tier coach in a train. I always prefer the lower berth." It is such a relatable way to think about it. We've got the union tier on the top bunk, the state tier in the middle, and now we are exploring that highly essential lower berth of local governance. Decentralization is exactly what it sounds like. It happens when power is actively taken away from those central and state governments and handed directly to local governments, like panchayats in villages and municipalities in urban areas. The logic here is incredibly straightforward, and it affects you directly. You and your neighbors simply have the best knowledge of your own neighborhood's problems. Local people know exactly where the money actually needs to be spent to fix the potholes on their own streets or improve their local schools. It is the truest form of local self-government. But here's the thing. For a long time, these local bodies existed, but they were weak. They had no real power or money. To make decentralization a reality, massive constitutional amendments were passed in 1992. And these were genuinely revolutionary. They made local elections constitutionally mandatory. They reserved seats for historically marginalized groups like SC, SD, and OBC, and guaranteed that at least 1/3 of all positions be reserved for women. They created independent state election commissions to run these elections fairly. And most importantly, they legally forced state governments to actually hand over real revenue and power to these local bodies, giving them the teeth they needed to actually function. I want to wrap up this explainer with a thought-provoking scenario straight from our source material that tests everything we've covered today. Imagine 3 different states have completely different policies on how their police should respond to local conflicts. Considering that police is strictly on the state list we discussed earlier, can the Prime Minister of India intervene and pass an order forcing those chief ministers to obey a single national policy? It really begs the question, where does central power truly end and state autonomy begin? Think about that as you consider the incredible, fragile balancing act that is federalism. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the architecture of power works around you.